Hi guys, welcome to this skill acquisition in sport video. In this video we're going to talk about how we can classify abilities. So when we talk about abilities, we should remember that we're not talking about skills. You can go and watch the skill or ability video for clarification on that, but just briefly here, an ability is something that's innate to our bodies, some capability or capacity that we're genetically predisposed to. We have it, we didn't learn it. And we take these abilities and we hone them and combine them to produce skilled performance. So in this video, I'm going to describe the 3 different classifications of ability that we can then take and combine for skilled performance. Let's take a look. So the first category for abilities is perceptual abilities, which obviously relates to perception or the ability to perceive. So in this case, as we're talking about sport, we're talking about the ability to perceive, for example, the flight of the ball, or a teammate's run, or a deflection off the net, or something similar. Things that we can see. Or we might be talking about hearing a call from a coach or a teammate, and for example, hearing a man on shout and then quickly making sense of that shout. So essentially then what we're talking about when we say perceptual abilities are the player's abilities to manipulate the sense data internally that's arriving from the external environment and to interpret that in some way. So to manipulate the sense data, whether that's sight, sound, whatever it might be, and interpret that sense data, interpret that information. We'll talk more about perception and how it works in another video, but for now, let's just acknowledge that there is a set of abilities that we each have relating to perception. And they come from our various senses. Now, the key ones for most of us will be sight and sound, or sight and hearing, but we also use sense data from touch, for example, during our sport. Perhaps we get a contact from another player and it affects our balance and we need to respond to the strength or the power of that contact from somebody else, maybe a shoulder barge or shoulder charge in football or something like that, and we need to respond to it. So we need to have sensed that touch in order to be able to interpret it and make sense of that sense data. Now, we're unlikely, I suppose, to use much sense data from smell or taste, although there might be times when that's a factor. For example, in motocross or Formula One, for example, perhaps when certain smells might indicate a problem with the car. But all in all, these abilities are those abilities that relate to how well we perceive and take in information about what's going on around us. These are perceptual abilities. Now, our second classification of abilities is psychomotor abilities. Psychomotor abilities. Now, you can probably guess from the name of this classification with the word psychomotor. Psycho meaning thought or cognition, and motor meaning movement. That these are abilities that link our brains and our bodies, or more specifically, our brains and our muscles. Now, we're often very familiar with the idea that our brains communicate with our muscles by sending signals to them to contract. But we're less familiar with the idea that our muscles talk back to our brains. And one of the key ways that this is done is through something called proprioception. Now, proprioceptive sense, our body's inbuilt ability to sense where it is in space, how fast it's moving, the direction it's traveling, and so on. This proprioceptive sense is another important psychomotor sense that helps us in sport, because proprioception provides us with internal information that comes from our muscles and tells us about the speed of our movement across the pitch. It gives us a sense of balance, or we can interpret and make sense of our balance, stability, dynamic equilibrium as we run with a ball, and so on. And so these psychomotor abilities are the sorts of abilities that relate to how well our brain and our muscles link together. So you can see on the diagram there, we've got these yellow arrows going in both directions to indicate that that information passes in both directions, both from brain to muscle, but also from muscle back to brain. So some other abilities that relate to the brain-muscle connection include things like reaction time, or coordination and balance. And all of these depend on the lines of communication between brain and muscle. And much of that is genetically determined. Not all of it, but to a large extent, that connection is genetically determined. And we can improve them, and we can hone them, and we can turn them to use in certain skills. But essentially, those psychomotor abilities, because they are in fact abilities, that's what we mean, those things are innate. And these psychomotor abilities relate to both fine and gross body movements, though perhaps you could argue that they're particularly relevant, although they're present in gross and fine movements, but particularly relevant to finer movements like those that you might need for archery or snooker or curling and sports like that. So the third and the final category is gross motor abilities. Gross motor abilities. So these abilities would be things like strength, speed, flexibility, and they underpin a lot of the bigger movements that we see in sport, like jumping, running, swimming, and so on. So remember, we're talking about abilities rather than skills here. So we're talking about things that are innate, genetically predetermined features of your body that you will then draw upon to help you to produce a skilled performance. So these are the sorts of abilities that are obvious to the outside viewer, someone who's watching you play. So there you can see the diagram with arrows pointing outwards from the diagram to represent the fact that this is having an impact in the external environment. So these are gross motor abilities. They relate specifically here to the abilities that you have for movement. So not perception, not necessarily psychomotor abilities, the brain-body link or the brain-muscle link, but specifically for movement. And whereas an observer can't necessarily see the first two categories of ability, they can't see you perceiving something, they can't see you perceiving the flight of a ball, nor can they see the electrical impulses flying back and forth along your neurons from brain to muscle and back again. But they can see the speed of your movement. They can see your arm speed when you swing the racket head to meet your opponent's serve. Or they can see your arm speed when you throw a ball from the boundary and it reaches the stumps. Maybe they might see your leg strength when you're in the middle of a driving maul. Maybe they might be able to see your leg power exploding out of the blocks. So these gross motor abilities are those abilities that underlie the larger muscular movements that we produce when we're engaged in skilled performance. So we have perceptual abilities, where we manipulate sense data and interpret information that's coming in via our senses. That's one set of abilities, or one classification of abilities. The second classification would be psychomotor abilities, the link between the brain and the body. And the final classification would be gross motor abilities, those abilities that relate specifically to the movement of the body. So I hope that's been a helpful little introduction to the different classifications of ability. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll happily answer any questions that you've got. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe and hit the notification icon so you can get notified every time I upload a new video. And that's it for now, so I'll see you in the next video. Take care.